was grabbing a coffee with the old colleague last week, and this is a guy who's spent the better part of the last decade drafting white papers on, democratic transitions in the Middle East.
Right, one of those guys.
Exactly. And he was scrolling through the latest reports on Operation Eagle Eye, and he just looked more energized than I'd seen him in years. He says, finally, tapping this grainy photo of smoke rising over the Barmal Highway, we're actually finishing the job. It's about time we showed that the West still has the resolve to enforce its values.
A familiar sentiment, that kind of moral clarity.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
He had this almost nostalgic fervor, the kind that views every missile as a moral statement. But then I pointed to a small kind of overlooked detail in the operational briefing.
What was that?
The deconflicted intelligence channels, the synchronized movements between U.S. strike packages and Syrian government ground forces. And I just asked him, how does his triumph of values square with the fact that the coordinates for those strikes were, they were essentially being cross-referenced with the very regime he'd spent 10 years trying to dismantle.
And what did he say?
The shift was instantaneous. The energy didn't just fade it curdled. He didn't offer some big economic defense or a strategic counter-argument. Nothing. He just stared at his espresso for a long beat, and then he muttered, well, the highway has to stay open. Someone has to keep the lights on. Yeah. The moral high ground he'd been standing on just seconds before had completely bottomed out. It was replaced by this cold, hollow pragmatism.
And that right there, that pivot in the coffee shop, that's our story.
It's the whole story. That sudden, silent pivot from the high-minded rhetoric of regime change to the grim, functional reality of order maintenance. That's the real story behind Operation Eagle Eye. It isn't just a tactical success. It's a diagnostic moment for the global order.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It reveals a world where the old ideological scripts have basically been burned, and now Washington and Damascus are reading from the same blood-stained map of geopolitical realism.
So the big question for our deep dive today is, what happens to the liberal order when the only thing that matters is who can keep the road clear?
That is precisely the core observation we need to confirm and really dissect. The shift you just described, it's a transition from those high-minded ideological scripts, the politics of aspiration, you could call it, to a cold, results-oriented geopolitical realism.
So we're seeing the currency of global power redefine itself right in front of our eyes.
We are. It's no longer about, say, democratic legitimacy. The new currency is the guaranteed provision of basic safety and stability, state capacity.
So our mission today is to cut through that nostalgic rhetoric, the kind my colleague had, and dissect the brutal implications of this shift. We need to understand not just that this change happened, but why it happened now and what it really means for global stability.
Exactly. We're looking at a hard pivot toward order maintenance, and this is the critical part, state capacity. The sources you've shared, they paint a comprehensive picture of a world where the ability to govern, to secure territory, and to project decisive kinetic force is, well, it's the ultimate measure of relevance.
Of functional legitimacy.
Of functional legitimacy, yes. Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this new grammar of power then. We've got 3 core threads from the source material that should structure this deep dive, and they lead us right to the heart of this whole transformation.
All right, so first, we really have to focus on the fundamental strategic shift. The protection of Eurasian trade corridors and infrastructure security, that's replacing ideological expansion.
Right, so how state capacity and just maintaining logistics have completely superseded the desire for, ideological conformity.
Precisely, that's the first threat.
And second, there's the political acid test of this new reality. The pragmatic collaboration. I mean, we can call it what it is, a de facto alliance between Washington and the new Damascus government in this coordinated action against ISIS.
That is a definitive case study. It shows the decline of liberal interventionism and the return to a results-oriented model of governance. Physical order is just prioritized over everything else.
Over procedural democracy.
Over everything. And finally, we have to analyze the frankly chilling rise of technocratic warfare itself. We need to look at how Operation Eagle Eye actually defined success.
Because the measure isn't a political victory or some moral achievement?
No. It's the surgical restoration of physical certainty, of predictable outcomes. We're going to be analyzing kill chain efficacy as the ultimate metric of civilizational resilience.
That roadmap ensures we don't just see the action in Syria as, an isolated event, but as a blueprint for the post-liberal era. Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So Section 1. Let's start with the operation itself, Operation Eagle Eye. And based on the reports, it felt less like a traditional war and more like a clinical display of force. We're talking about the precision and physical punishment that defines this new style of warfare.
And the operational context is absolutely essential here. Operation Eagle Eye, it was launched in swift retaliation for an ambush. But an ambush that specifically targeted logistics convoys on the Barmal Highway.
So the focus wasn't fighting some generalized enemy ideology.
Not at all. It was an immediate functional response to a disruption of the logistical sinews of the entire region. A direct physical threat to the flow of goods and resources. That's it.
And the nature of that response, it reflects this brutal pragmatism, doesn't it? The sources describe the strike as transcending a mere tactical action. They call it a calibrated physical reprisal designed to reset the environment.
Indeed. And the key takeaway from all the operational reports is the metric of success. We are completely divorced here from the qualitative metrics we used to talk about in counterinsurgency, like hearts and minds or achieving moral justification.
Right, no more democracy promotion.
None. The focus was entirely on technocratic execution and measurable physical output. So things like the destruction rate of identified command nodes, weapon depots, communication hubs, hard targets.
I kept circling back to that number in the material, the one that said a target neutralization efficiency exceeding 92%. I mean, that figure is astonishingly high. But like you said, it's entirely amoral. It's just about maximizing kinetic results in the shortest time frame possible.
Precisely. That figure is purely a measure of command and control efficacy. This is how a modern state proves its capability. It demonstrates its ability to convert timely intelligence into precise, high-yield ordnance efficiently and reliably across a complex operating environment.
So the operation itself becomes a kind of a test.
A stress test for governance. It measures a state's stress resilience.
That framing, stress resilience, is really powerful. Can you elaborate on how we should interpret that term, in the context of state capacity?
Well, when we talk about stress resilience, we mean the ability to absorb a significant shock like the ambush of a vital logistics route, and then convert that provocation into immediate, organized kinetic force, all without suffering political paralysis or systemic failure.
It's about the speed and predictability of the reaction.
Exactly. In this environment of persistent, low-intensity conflict, where these non-state actors are constantly probing for weakness, predictable, overwhelming retaliation becomes the essential currency of deterrence.
So if you can guarantee that any disruption will be met instantly with overwhelming force,
you establish an order that is functionally reliable. It might be harsh, but it's reliable.
And if a state takes weeks to organize a response, or if the response is politically messy and misses its targets, its stress resilience is low, no matter its ideology.
That's it exactly. The modern system prioritizes the guaranteed function over the high ideal. A state that can't protect its physical arteries, regardless of how democratic it is on paper, is perceived as a failing state. What Eagle Eye demonstrated was the capacity to deliver an iron-fisted certainty.
This feels like a fundamental redefinition of power in this post-liberal era. It's no longer about influence or soft power or even abstract economic advantage.
It is a return to a stark, realist principle. Only physical results, creation or destruction, constitute real power. All the abstract rhetoric, all the talk about values, morality, international standing, it all just falls away when measured against the state's proven ability to manage violence and secure its physical domains.
If you cannot secure the infrastructure you rely on, you don't possess real power. You are just a subject to external forces.
You're just reacting. You're not in control.
And the sources, they include this one illustrative anecdote that really brings this home. It contrasts the, theoretical ideas with the practical reality on the ground. The story of the local tracker who observed the aftermath of the strikes.
Yes, that local tracker anecdote is deeply revealing. He saw the precision strikes less like an act of traditional war and more like a high-tech utility repair.
A utility repair.
Think about that language. He wasn't evaluating the morality of the state conducting the strike. He was valuing the restoration of a predictable, functional environment. He wasn't looking for a new constitution. He was looking for functional efficiency that enables daily life, the ability for the trucks to run, the markets to open, and the lights to stay on.
And that state capacity, the speed and accuracy of the kill chain, that's what people cling to as their hope for a predictable future.
Absolutely.
That contrast between the moral judgment from outside observers and the desperate desire for functional stability from those living under threat, that's a perfect transition point. Because that functional necessity brings us directly to the great paradox of this whole situation. The nexus, the burial of regime change.
Absolutely. The operation's physical execution is, in some ways, less telling than the political and operational reality that enabled such precision in the first place.
So we have to detail the unprecedented nature of this de facto on-ground coordination between U.S. forces and the new Syrian government, a regime that was, until very recently, the target of explicit U.S. regime change policy.
Right, and we need to be clear about what that coordination looked like. Was it just implicit?
It seems far from it.
Far from it. This wasn't just some blind alignment of interests. The collaboration included the use of deconflicted intelligence channels and synchronized movements. The whole point was to ensure U.S. strike packages didn't accidentally hit Syrian government ground forces, and vice versa.
I mean, that kind of real-time coordination suggests a deep tactical trust. It just bypasses decades of political hostility.
It signals a massive, decisive political shift. The sources call it a decisive retreat from veto politics, and it's worth unpacking what that means.
So what exactly were veto politics, and why is their burial so significant?
Veto politics was the ideological gridlock that historically paralyzed Western action in places like Syria. It was that endless debate, driven by liberal interventionist ideals over whether engaging an authoritarian or illegitimate regime would morally compromise democratic goals.
The argument being, we can't solve the problem if it means bolstering a bad actor.
Exactly. The new reality, exemplified by Operation Eagle Eye, just bypasses that political theology entirely. It dictates that strategic necessity, the absolute requirement to eliminate ISIS remnants and secure global trade routes, has to override ideological purity.
So Washington's actions here are an implicit functional acknowledgement of the new Damascus government, despite its highly contested legitimacy and its background.
That's exactly right. Washington's pragmatic engagement acknowledges this regime, which we'll get into more detail on later, as an irreplaceable provider of minimum order in the Levantine heartland.
It's a convergence with a classical Machiavellian logic. The enemy of my enemy is a tactical partner.
It's even more than that. It's that the state that can manage the violence is the necessary partner. This collaboration is a rational acknowledgement of state capacity, the only entity that actually maintains the monopoly on violence and administrative reach across that critical strategic territory.
It's a stark reversal. But for the people living there, it seems this is just a necessary function of life. The sources ground this ideological recoil in human necessity with the anecdote of Layla, the pharmacist in Damascus.
Layla's story is such a critical human lens for this. For Western policymakers, the question is, who is procedurally legitimate? But for Layla, the question is, who is functionally effective?
She didn't care about the procedural legitimacy of the new government, which, let's be honest, is highly questionable.
Of course. She cared that her pharmacy stayed open, that the supply trucks could reach the city, and that her children had, as the source puts it, freedom from fear.
So in that environment, freedom from fear becomes the ultimate right, and it just eclipses all the others.
It does. And this stark equation reveals that for people ravaged by conflict, the primary right is physical safety and the predictable functioning of critical infrastructure. The failure of liberal interventionism was the failure to deliver this basic physical certainty. In its absence, people will support the entity, whatever its ideology, that proves capable of restoring order.
Which brings us naturally to the third major point of this section, the primacy of order over liberty. If security is the new foundational right, then we need a total recalibration of concepts like human rights and state legitimacy.
We absolutely do. In regions that have been ravaged by non-state terror, the liberal concept of political rights, freedom of speech, free assembly, it all just takes a backseat to the immediate existential right to freedom from fear and the predictable functioning of things like the Barmal Highway or the electrical grid.
So legitimacy is redefined. It's moved away from elections and toward measurable, observable outcomes, a definition that the average citizen on the street would probably agree with.
Precisely. A government's legitimacy derives first and foremost from its administrative efficacy in guaranteeing these basic elements of life. The grim logic of this new realism is that order must precede liberty.
You can't meaningfully exercise political liberty in a functioning society if you can't guarantee that society will even survive the week.
Or if the road that transports your food is constantly under attack. It's that basic.
And the fact that the new Syrian government, for all its problematic history and origins, is now seen as capable of delivering this minimum order. that accrues it a form of grim, pragmatic legitimacy in the eyes of external powers, like the U.S., who just need that regional stability.
That is the crucial observation. It's functional legitimacy. The U.S. needs a partner capable of controlling the territory and eliminating threats. The identity of that partner matters far less than its capacity.
And what does this functional, results-oriented approach suggest about the remaining enemies, like the remnants of ISIS that Operation Eagle Eye was targeting? How are they being categorized now?
The sources use a striking, almost biological term. They define ISIS remnants as non-educable factors.
Non-educable factors.
It's a profound shift in language. It moves them from being political insurgents that one might negotiate with or, defeat through ideological persuasion,
to being agents of pure social entropy, a malignancy.
A malignancy whose only function is to dismantle the very trust required for any complex society to exist.
So if they are non-educable factors, what's the justified response?
Their eradication is viewed not as an ideological crusade, but as a necessary immunological response, a costly, brutal surgery required to excise the malignancy from the societal organism.
So only after this physical certainty is restored, after this surgery, can the possibility of a high-trust society even begin to regrow.
Exactly. This framing justifies total elimination for the sake of societal health, and it places the need for physical order above any procedural constraints that might apply to handling political enemies.
That is deeply chilling, but also highly efficient in terms of establishing an operational doctrine. It moves them from a political challenge to a physical threat, justifying total eradication for the sake of stability.
It reflects the ruthless, pragmatic pursuit of stability that defines this new era. And the provider of that essential surgery, by default, accrues the temporary, functional legitimacy required to keep the continent's logistical arteries flowing.
And this functional necessity is the gravitational force pushing global powers past political theology and into hard geopolitics.
Exactly.
Okay, let's follow that gravitational pull directly into the global implications. Because this isn't just a local skirmish in Syria, this is about the Eurasian continent. It's about global trade. This shift to order realism is deeply linked to securing the logistical sinews of Eurasia.
This is where we have to apply the heartland theory lens to Syria's stability. For decades, the Western focus was on Syria's ideological positioning. Now the focus is entirely on its geographic positioning.
It's not just a patch of troubled land anymore.
No, it sits astride the crucial connective tissue of Eurasia and Africa. Its stability is a deep, long-term strategic imperative because it's a precondition for massive continental logistics. We're talking future pipelines, rail corridors linking the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, key trade arteries.
It seems the goal has fundamentally shifted from controlling local ideology to just controlling and guaranteeing the security of the global supply chain that runs through the region.
It's moving from controlling the people to controlling the pipes and the roads.
Absolutely. The quiet collaboration between Washington and Damascus, however temporary or distasteful it might be to some, is fundamentally about securing these physical connections. The whole narrative shifts from value exportation, that incredibly costly burden of trying to transform societies, to hard logistics and continental integration.
And this shift in priorities suggests a parallel transformation in the U.S. posture in the region, doesn't it?
It certainly does. The U.S. role appears to be moving away from the messy, expensive commitment of nation building.
The traditional liberal interventionist model.
Right. And it's moving toward a more sustainable, cost-effective position, an offshore order maintainer.
So instead of trying to run the entire system, the focus is on leveraging local power centers, even unsavory ones, to manage chaos and ensure the global trading system isn't disrupted.
It's realism replacing missionary zeal. U.S. involvement is solely transactional, a service provided to the global commercial architecture.
And this transactional nature is perfectly illustrated by that story of Omar, the logistics foreman.
Right. His story is such a powerful illustration of the infrastructure becoming sacred. His focus shifted entirely away from factional loyalty, sectarian identity, political idealism, all the things that drove the initial conflicts.
And it shifted to the practical reality of logistics. The tonnage of grain, textiles, and electronics moving through the Eurasian trade corridor. For him, the infrastructure itself, the rail terminal, the grain elevator, the asphalt road, has become sacred.
Because it represents predictability, economic survival, and peace.
And in a way, the West's strategic shift to corridor security aligns perfectly with Omar's personal interests in stability.
It validates results-oriented pragmatism over ideological dreams. If the U.S. presence, even through cold collaboration with Damascus, guarantees that Omar can move his tonnage safely and predictably, then that presence gains a form of tacit legitimacy on the ground that decades of democracy promotion could never achieve.
The road in this scenario is the ultimate measure of success.
The sources then clearly link this infrastructure focus to the Massive Development Road Initiative, which is a huge project reshaping regional economics and geopolitical alignments.
The Development Road Initiative, sometimes called the Iraq Development Road, is a massive economic and strategic imperative. It links the Gulf to Turkey. If it's successfully executed, it will profoundly alter regional alignments, creating a new logistical backbone for the Levant and Mesopotamia.
What are the key goals there, and what's the potential geopolitical fallout if this project succeeds?
Well, the goals are multifaceted. First, it's designed to enhance Turkey's role as a major transit hub, cementing its critical position. Second, it's essential for accelerating Iraq's post-war reconstruction. Third, it deeply integrates Gulf economies into regional trade networks, creating massive economic interdependence.
And this project provides a necessary alternative to current routes, correct?
Yes. It offers a viable alternative to existing trade corridors that are constrained by various factors, especially maritime routes through unstable choke points. By securing this land corridor, the Development Road Initiative ties the long-term stability of Syria and Iraq directly to the economic future of the entire continent.
Which makes the Barmal Highway ambush and Operation Eagle Eye immediate threats to massive future economic potential.
Absolutely. And you have to recognize the strategic importance of energy geopolitics woven into this infrastructure push, particularly concerning areas like Mosul and Kirkuk.
Right. Energy geopolitics is intrinsically linked to the development road. The security of pipelines is paramount.
And debates regarding regions like Mosul and Kirkuk, which are historically and resource-rich, carry renewed geopolitical significance now. The desire to secure these energy hubs fuels regional tensions and reinforces the importance of state capacity in these critical areas.
The Mosul question, specifically, has these deep historical roots that seem to be bubbling back up because of this instability.
That's a key detail. The legal status of Mosul, which was separated from Ottoman sovereignty after the Armistice of Mudros, remains, in a sense, a suspended status in international law. It was a classic example of imperial power balances defining borders.
And now, given the renewed indeterminacy of the region and the massive economic stakes, that historical ambiguity is being revisited.
It is, which brings this entire realignment into its broader transformative context, the multipolar context and the revival of historical claims.
This is the global foundation supporting the local shift. We are witnessing the structural transformation of the international system toward a multipolar configuration, driven by the relative decline of U.S. hegemony.
And the diminishing effectiveness of multilateral institutions like the UN, which historically enforced the unipolar rule set.
This transition, according to the sources, creates what they term a normative relaxation in international law. That sounds incredibly dangerous. What does that actually look like on the ground?
That term, normative relaxation, is brilliant because it captures the essence of the shift. It means the established rules and principles, like the inviolability of post-colonial borders, are becoming flexible, even negotiable.
It doesn't mean the UN is suddenly ignored.
No, it just means states feel less constrained by external norms because they know the hegemonic power either lacks the will or the capacity to enforce them decisively. The understanding that borders are sacrosanct is weakening.
And we see the concrete result of this in regional fragmentation, specifically in Syria and Iraq.
Precisely. The collapse of state authority in Iraq post-2003 and in Syria during the Civil War has led to the de facto invalidation of borders. This whole fragmentation process is linked in academic literature to the failed Greater Middle East project, the notion of creative chaos that ultimately just deepened regional instability.
So if the external powers, particularly the U.S., inadvertently demonstrated that borders could change through regime change policies, they essentially gave tacit permission for regional players to step in with their own historical claims.
That's the logical strategic outcome. The failure of Western regime change strategies has necessitated that regional powers, particularly Turkey, develop their own security architecture. And Turkey is now exploiting this environment to redefine its regional sphere of influence, bringing its historical claims based on the National Pact, or Misak-Milli, back onto the agenda.
For our listeners who might not be familiar, what does the Misak-Milli entail?
The National Pact was an early declaration by the Turkish national movement in 1920. It stated that national borders should be determined based on regions inhabited by an Ottoman Islamic majority. Crucially, this historically includes claims over areas like Mosul and Kirkuk in Iraq and parts of northern Syria.
And why are these historical arguments gaining legitimacy now, during this shift to multipolarity?
Because the revival of these historical arguments is viewed by Ankara as a rational strategic stance. During periods of power transition and systemic instability, like now, historical arguments gain a functional legitimacy. States use them to compensate for regional fragmentation and establish stable, defensible spheres of influence.
So in the absence of a strong, consensus-based international order guaranteeing post-colonial borders,
Turkey is not just reacting tactically, it's integrating its security requirements, like counterterrorism and securing energy transit routes, with a historical and normative framework, making its claims more robust.
so the U.S. retreat from ideological missionary zeal in Syria inadvertently strengthened the hand of regional powers looking to redefine the entire map of the Levant.
Precisely. It creates a normative vacuum. In that vacuum, power will flow to those who demonstrate both the will and the capacity to secure critical infrastructure and impose order, even if that order is defined by historical claims and strategic depth rather than international law.
Okay, so we've established the global pivot to order realism and the geopolitical context. Now we have to look closer at the entity the U.S. is actually coordinating with, the new post-Assad government in Damascus, which is led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. This is a story of swift state collapse, followed by a highly volatile, highly fragile attempt at state capacity building.
And this transition was almost impossibly swift. It just demonstrates how hollowed out the Assad regime had become. The regime collapsed in early December 2024 following Operation Deterrence of Aggression, which was spearheaded by HTS.
The speed was breathtaking. Aleppo fell on November 29th, Hama on December 5th, and then Homs and Damascus fell by December 8th. Assad just fled.
That speed indicates not just a defeat, but a near-total vacuum of centralized force across most of the country. The Syrian Arab Armed Forces, the SAF, offered surprisingly little coordinated resistance.
And that vacuum had to be filled immediately, or you would have just had complete social entropy.
Exactly. And the person who filled that vacuum, the person the U.S. is now tacitly cooperating with, was Ahmed al-Shara. And we need to pause and really explain who he is, given the immense political gravity here.
Right.
Ahmed al-Shara, formerly known as Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, is the leader of HTS. And it is critical to note that HTS has a Salafi jihadist background and was formerly aligned with al-Qaeda until late 2016 or early 2017.
That's when they formally broke ties, rebranded, and started focusing on governance and counter-extremism within their own territory.
Right, but that context is crucial. The U.S. is functionally collaborating with the leader of a rebranded former al-Qaeda affiliate in the capital of Syria.
So what was his immediate priority when he took power?
Al-Shara appointed himself president in January 2025. And his declared priorities were profoundly pragmatic. They were focused entirely on state function, filling the power vacuum, preserving civil peace, building state institutions. HTS loyalists were quickly installed in senior positions, especially in the Ministry of Defense and the general security apparatus.
It was an attempt to transition from an insurgency to a functional, if heavily controlled, state structure.
And that leads us to the extreme difficulties of security sector reform, or SSR. How do you transition a country composed of rival militias, some of them extremist, into a cohesive, professional national military?
It's the central, maybe impossible dilemma of this new state.
The government tried to establish a monopoly on armed force by integrating diverse factions: the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, the National Liberation Front, various local militias, all under the MOD umbrella.
But the sources suggest this integration is severely flawed. It's largely superficial.
It's marred by the reality that HTS officials, with their hardened, centralized command structure, remain firmly in control. The integration often exists merely on paper. It's a dangerous process of rehatting militias.
So old loyalties and chains of command remain intact. They're just wearing a new uniform.
Exactly. Furthermore, the burden of paying these integrated militias has shifted entirely to the new Damascus government, which is struggling to manage the required strength of an estimated 300,000 soldiers for the new army. It's creating immense fiscal pressure and corruption.
And what happened to the core of the old regime forces, the people who might have been able to provide institutional memory and the secular control?
Former SAF officers and NCOs, many from the Alawite community which had dominated the Assad government, were explicitly excluded from the general amnesty. Many faced expected prosecution for war crimes or simply fled. This created a large, armed, disciplined, and ideologically committed pool of disenfranchised men who knew how the state worked.
And these excluded elements didn't just disappear. They led directly to significant internal instability almost immediately, highlighting the immense internal tensions and sectarian backlash.
Yes. The disenfranchised former regime members and Alawites returned to their coastal heartlands, Latakia and Tartus. This led to the swift emergence of insurgent networks known as Fulul, or remnants, like the Syrian Islamic Resistance Front.
And these groups were often supported by external patrons like Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, who saw an opportunity to destabilize the new government.
And they were motivated by stark financial incentives due to mass unemployment after the regime collapse.
This cocktail of historical grievance, external backing, and economic desperation was just ripe for sectarian violence to flare up.
And it exploded in the March 2025 violence. The Fool challenged government authority in key coastal cities, killing over 200 members of the new General Security Forces in a few days. The government response was chaotic and decentralized. Sunni communities mobilized independently, including thousands of armed civilians from the SNA and HTS units.
And the outcome revealed the deep fragility of the new state.
It was catastrophic. The sources report widespread sectarian violence and mass killings of over 1,400 Alawite civilians in a retaliatory violence. This incident was a stark demonstration of two systemic failures.
What were they?
First, the new General Security Forces were poorly trained and quickly overrun, showing the profound fragility of the new state apparatus. And second, it highlighted the deep sectarian tensions and the catastrophic failure to properly demobilize the militias, which leads directly to atrocities when central authority is challenged.
And this internal chaos, this former al-Qaeda affiliate struggling to control sectarian warfare, is the very context in which the U.S. is deepening its coordination. So let's look at the seemingly impossible reality of U.S. coordination with the new Damascus government.
The sources confirm that U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, is deepening cooperation specifically against the remnants of ISIS, the non-educable factor we discussed. Admiral Brad Cooper, the CENTCOM commander, highlighted that U.S. forces advised, assisted, and enabled Syrian partners in more than 20 operations in October 2025 alone.
And this is far from simple, distant advice. It involves integrated, actionable intelligence sharing with the new government security apparatus.
It is highly integrated and purely transactional. In late November 2025, CTCOM personnel and the Syrian Ministry of Interior, which controls the very forces that were just overrun in March, worked directly together to locate and destroy over 15 sites containing ISIS weapons caches in Rif Damash province.
Using both U.S. airstrikes and joint ground detonations.
Correct. The focus is purely tactical, diminishing the immediate threat of terror attacks that could destabilize those vital logistical corridors.
What's truly astonishing here is that the U.S., which once backed the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, against the Assad regime, is now trying to integrate the SDF, its longtime partner, into the HTS-led Syrian government.
That is the ultimate litmus test of this new pragmatic realism. CENTCOM is actively facilitating talks to integrate the SDF into the new Syrian Arab Republic. And the SDF is a formidable force, 70,000 to 100,000 combatants. Critically, they control about 40% of Syria's resources, including vast petroleum deposits. They're an indispensable partner.
But the SDF has political demands that fundamentally clash with the new Damascus government's priority for centralized control.
They do. The SDF seeks autonomy, the right to remain a separate military structure. Damascus, however, initially rejected this, viewing autonomy as a fundamental threat to centralized state capacity.
So where do things stand now?
Well, Al-Chara and SDF commander Mazloum Abdi signed an integration agreement in March 2025, but implementation has been glacially slow. There are concerns over the new constitutional declaration, but U.S. pressure for integration is continuous as CENTCOM pushes for a more predictable and stable security environment that allows for a unified front against ISIS.
And finally, the ultimate ISIS crisis remains the detention camps, which are just radicalizing new generations.
Yes, the Al-Hol and Raj camps. This is viewed by all parties, the U.S., the Syrian government, and the Kurdish-led administration, as both a humanitarian imperative and a strategic necessity.
There are about 26,000 residents still in these camps.
Mostly women and children linked to ISIS. They represent a ticking time bomb of future radicalization. A tripartite meeting between the Kurdish administration, the Syrian government, and the global coalition against Daesh established a joint mechanism to remove Syrian families from the camps.
This situation just perfectly encapsulates the entire deep dive, doesn't it? The sheer functional necessity of preventing 26,000 people from radicalizing is driving a cooperation between Washington and a former al-Qaeda affiliate running Damascus.
It is a clear-cut example of security realism driving humanitarian action. It prioritizes the prevention of future radicalization and the restoration of order over all other concerns. It confirms the central argument. The era of ideological missionary zeal is over. The only thing that matters is who can demonstrate decisive executive power and manage violence to ensure the minimum order required for global commerce and regional stability.
Okay, let's synthesize the tectonic plates we've deep dived into today. The core takeaway really starts with that silent pivot my colleague made in the coffee shop. The shift from liberal democracy promotion to raw transactional order maintenance.
That pivot is epitomized by Operation Eagle Eye, coordinating strikes with former adversaries to clear roads, to destroy weapons caches, to maintain power lines. That is the new, unsentimental grammar of global power.
We've moved from aspiring to remake nations in our image to simply trying to keep the lights on and the supply chains open,
regardless of the ideological makeup of the entity currently holding Damascus.
So Operation Eagle Eye and the quiet, functional Washington-Damascus nexus, they serve as the comprehensive autopsy report for the liberal international order. The age of veto politics and ideological gridlock is functionally over because it failed to deliver the foundational requirements of stability.
That's correct. The ticket to relevance in the contemporary system is now held by states that demonstrate decisive executive power and the proven ability to manage violence and secure logistical sinews. In this stark environment of geopolitical realism, order has definitively supplanted liberty as the foundational currency of statecraft.
Because physical certainty has to precede the possibility of a high-trust society.
It has to.
The ultimate geopolitical shift, then, isn't just about what changed in Syria, but what the Syrian experience reveals globally. The end of ideological missionary zeal and the ruthless pragmatic pursuit of stable spheres of influence in a multipolar world where infrastructure and physical certainty are the highest virtues.
It's the acceptance that when the hegemonic power retreats or loses focus, regional players will inevitably move to fill the normative vacuum. They will leverage concepts like state capacity and infrastructure security, often using historical frameworks like the National Pact to define their own stable spheres. What we see in Syria, the HTS regime striving for functional legitimacy, the U.S. seeking transactional stability, and regional powers asserting historical claims, is the functional blueprint for how power will be exercised in the post-liberal era.